your late game and play it too, Brian Kibler. N'Zoth is definitely a greedy choice for him, and very little cycle in the deck.
Yeah, he does have 2 copies of Lay on Hands. Those are a little slow, though, a little slow. But in this game here, Jasonzhou is the first one with an actual card on the board, coining out a Mana Tide Totem. That's pretty difficult for Hamster to deal with at this point in the game. We see the True Silver Champion in his hand, but he's only at 3 mana, so he's not going to be able to deploy that this turn. So it looks like he's mousing over that Doomsayer, thinking about trying to get a free turn with that and remove the totem.
Yeah, but the thing is when you play a Mana Tide Totem against the Paladin, if they don't have a way to answer it, which they usually don't unless they're playing like a copy of Rowling Blade, you get 2 draws out of the Mana Tide, even if it goes into a Doomsayer. And Jasonzhou doesn't have to worry about maybe a Solemn Vigil coming out from Hamster, which would punish him here. He could double Solemn Vigil, each for 1 mana in that situation, because of the fact that Hamster just doesn't have it.
Yeah, and we see the free turn that Hamster gets uses to just equip. Ooh, he equips a True Silver Champion, which immediately draws a Harrison Jones off the top for Jason. He does not have the mana to play it just yet. So I imagine Jason, we might see him kind of maneuver this turn not to give Hamster a good target for that True Silver Champion. He may have been considering playing Thing from Below. That is something that Hamster might use a charge to attack into if you were to play it here. He is going to play it anyway, so this will at least demand something in addition to the charge if Hamster is going to try and remove it.
One thing to note here with the greediness of Hamster's deck is that if he makes it to the late game, he's going to be in a better spot than if he was one or the other, whether it was anything or N'Zoth. One thing that Shamans do well against Paladin decks, the slow Paladin decks, is they can hex the crucial targets. Against anything, you can use a hex on a War Leader, and they never get that War Leader back from anything can happen. Against N'Zoth Paladin, you can use it on the Cairn, the Sylvanas, the Tyrians, to make sure that they don't get that back from N'Zoth. So not only do you pressure them early, you also have tools to counter their late game.
And Hamster chooses not to use his weapon. He chooses not to swing with the True Silver, wants to use a charge here, but it looks like Jason, he may actually not quite be able to play the Harrison without avoiding overdrawing.
Yeah, he has 9 cards right now, so if he plays Harrison and draws 2, he'll be at a full 10, which means that the next turn, he'll discard a card.
There's also the Doomsayer in play that Hamster played kind of as a tempo play. He just wants to get to the next turn. He only removes the Thing from Below, which he's already nullified largely with that Elder Peacekeeper. And we see kind of the results of Hamster's play here. He's been playing those Doomsayers into boards that he's already expended resources on or have already given Jason resources. So Hamster's kind of low on cards while Jason has nearly a full hand.
It's sort of the opposite of what you'd expect. Maybe not so with Hamster's deck, though, because as we mentioned, he lacks early cycle. So if he's playing a card early on, he's not necessarily replenishing it until later on. He relies heavily on mid-game draws to have plays.
But what Hamster is really looking to do is buy time. As we mentioned, his deck is really heavy on those late-game powerful cards. We see Lay on Hands, anything can happen already in his hand. If he is able to get to the stage of the game where he can just start playing those cards every turn, it's going to be difficult for Jason to mount a comeback.
You can see the blue lighting there for Sylvanas, pretty cool stuff. But once again, Jasonzhou is in a situation where it's going to be risky for him to play Harrison Jones. Now he's in a situation where he can play Tunnel Trog alongside Harrison Jones. But that means Sylvanas will have an easy target to steal, and then he'll still be in a situation, since he has 10 cards right now, where he discard a card going into the next turn. So this is an awkward spot for Jason, to say the least.
He does have the ability to hex this Sylvanas, but as you mentioned, there are a lot of key cards in Hamster's deck. You might see, oh, Sylvanas, great target to hex, but because of the anything can happen, because of the N'Zoth, there are so many things that you really want to use that hex on to prevent them from coming back later. Sylvanas is not at the top of the priority list.
Yeah, Tyrion is usually at the top of the priority list, which is usually run in both types of the deck. Having 2 Tyrions over the course of the game. Tyrion is probably the strongest card in Hearthstone.
Whoa! That is an amazing result from Barnes. From Hamster's perspective, a different kind of tale. Perhaps for Jason, it's a tale of terrible tragedy.
Yes, it is.
And speaking of hex targets, the Cairn, what makes Cairn so powerful is the fact that even if your opponent has like a big mass removal effect after you use your N'Zoth, it comes back. And here, Jason would possibly have to use a hex on the 1/1 of Cairn in order to prevent that from coming back from a N'Zoth later in the game.
Which also means that if Hamster plays the real Cairn later on in the game, that one would come back. And if Jason doesn't hex this, and the real one comes out and he doesn't hex that, then Hamster gets 2 cairns from the N'Zoth later on in the game.
I think Hamster is truly blessed by the light. I think that the light has shown favorably upon him.
He's the chosen one. He's the chosen one to carry Priest and Paladin through the World Championship.
Jason going with the Claws plus Maelstrom Portal. Gonna go ahead and try and clear off everything but Bane Bloodhoof here.
Turns out there's still a 4-5 on the board.
Yeah.
That's a rough position.
Whenever I was playing World of Warcraft and attacked Thunderbluff, there was always a Kane or Baron waiting there to kill me.
Yes, there is. Well, Hamster actually has both of his lay on hands early, so he does have his cycle. And he's actually in a good enough position now to where he can use them without fear of being pressured too hard. So this is a fantastic position for Hamster.
It's also worth noting that he chose to use lay on hands on his minion rather than his face. He healed 1 damage to his minion rather than 2 damage on him, just looking to preserve his minion's body against the possibility of a spell power, allowing the 1/1 plus the Spirit Claws to trade into it. But Jason does have Ragnaros. We saw this last game, and Bane goes down, but Hamster's hand, full of ways to deal with pretty much anything Jason can throw at him.
Yeah, but does he want to use an equality here to clear off pretty much just a Ragnaros? He does have Tyrion, but if a Hex were to come out, Hamster would be under a lot of pressure. And of course, Aldor Peacekeeper, as we know, doesn't do anything to Ragnaros. He's still gonna fire 8 damage shots.
Yeah, Hamster debating his options here. He's at a pretty high life total, so he doesn't necessarily have to deal with the Ragnaros now. He may want to wait and either deploy an additional minion, like this Tyrion he seems to be thinking about, or he is playing Paladin. He can just make the Silverhand recruits and potentially force Ragnaros to hit those, though, of course, Jason has the Spirit Claws that he can use to remove them, so not quite as good at preserving his life total. It will be Tyrion for Hamster here. Be interesting to see if he's choosing not to use the charge of his True Silver. Often players will use the last charge of a weapon when they play Tyrion, but he recognizes the threat of Hex come from Jasonzhou. It doesn't only just waste the charge of True Silver Champion in order to maximize the possibility of his Ashbringer getting value if it does die.
I mean, Hamster has had that True Silver equipped for many, many turns.
Yeah, turn 4.
Yeah, turn 4. So he says, well, if you have Harrison Jones and you haven't used it yet, sure, you just have it. And Jason actually draws the second Hex here with the Azure Drake, so he's got another removal for one of the big Death Rattle threats or one of those Murlocs that Hamster is going to throw on the board. And this is getting quite scary, but Hamster realizes this board is big enough now to where I can stand using one of these equality clears.
Yeah, he's going to drop a War Leader. Interesting to see if he does choose to use his Swamp Ooze, because if Jason has spell power, yeah, it's going to go ahead and Swamp Ooze the Spirit Claws, even just the single charge remaining. He wanted to avoid the possibility that Jason just had spell power and cleared one of his minions immediately with the Claws. You may get the bad news here, though, that Jason has not only another Spirit Claws, but a Lightning Storm and Azure Drake as well. So lots of options for Jason to remove this board.
Yeah, it's tough to say. Lightning Storm usually doesn't get too good in this matchup. One thing you can do is try and save it for Anyfin or N'Zoth to try and play a super late game. A lot of the times, if those come out in the late game, you usually will lose anyway if they've made it that far and haven't died yet.
Yeah.
But it is a strategy that you can go for. Jason has played this game very slowly, so it might be something on the back of his mind. But other than those specific situations, Lightning Storm doesn't have much of a use, so it would be pretty good here. But a lot of options. True Silver Champion still equipped. He could still go for the Harrison Jones to try and cycle. That would limit his options to get spell power for the Spirit Claws to clear up one of these minions. He'd have to rely on rolling a Wrath of Air Totem, but he's going to go for it.
Yeah, right now, Jason is just playing a resource game. He got those additional cards from the Manatide Totem early, and Hamster's pretty low on cards. He's already dealt with several of his most powerful threats. The Lightning Storm hitting high on the War Leader there means that Jason doesn't even need to use his Spirit Claws. He's just able to go on offense fully.
And Ivory Knight, 2 copies of that in Hamster's deck.
Not an exciting selection of Discover here. He can take Seal of Champions, Noble Sacrifice, Divine Strength. He would heal the most with Seal, but here he's looking more for value because, as you mentioned, he's kind of behind in terms of the resource war.
Yeah, one thing, though, is I believe, I don't think Hamster's taking much damage. His health bar is hidden at the moment. And
He's 16, if I recall correctly. He did take the Ragnaros hit to the face after taking a couple of hits.
So this is going to be...
he's going to go up to 19.
This is going to be actually pretty crucial for Jasonzhou. He's going to get a little bit of information. 3-mana Paladin spells are not that common.
There's Divine Favor is one that he might consider Hamster potentially taking in this spot because Jason has such a big hand.
Which could be a big deal because Jason has a lot more cards than Hamster for the time being.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if Jason does try to empty his hand now for fear of Divine Favor.
It is a card that could swing things. I mean, if Hamster were to draw, you know, even 2 to 3 cards next turn, then that could make this matchup a lot closer and a lot scarier for Jason as this game goes on.
But Jason is just fighting for the board here. The Flame Tongue reinvigorating Harrison Jones, allowing him to take down the Peacekeeper, getting revenge there. The real Karen decides to show up. Will the real Karen Bloodhoof please stand up? And Lay on Hands is going to be the play for Hamster. Digging deep here, he needs to find something to deal with this board that Jason is threatening. He finds both Consecrations in a Bluegill Warrior. So that Bluegill Warrior is the second Murloc he's drawn. So there is the War Leader we saw dying earlier. So anything can happen, still not terribly scary.
One thing that you have to note about mid-range Shaman is in the late game, they can turn things that aren't necessarily threats into threats. And by that I mean totems with the Thunderbolt Valiant. So you can't play this matchup too slowly because eventually they will whittle you down and they can still hold on to their big threats. So you can play it, you know, if they play it very slowly, maybe sometimes you can do it, but you always have to keep that in the back of your mind. How much damage could I possibly take? One thing to also note is Jasonzhou has a copy of Bloodlust in his hand and in this deck. So Hamster knows this. Of course, they know each other's deck lists. And so he might be thinking about that in the back of his head. He'll play around the max possible damage of it moving forward here.
Yeah, and looks like Jason is looking to go with Thunderbolt Valiant here. He's able to play this pretty slowly, as you mentioned, because he does have that resource advantage. I'm a little surprised to see him going with the Thunderbuff here, just because he already has such threat on board, and Hamster did just reload. He just drew 3 cards from that Lay on Hands, and Jason, he's going to go ahead and clear things off here and just push. How much damage is this? It looks like 11, 12, 13 to Hamster. So he does put Hamster in a position where he's threatening, if his board survives, to just win the game with Bloodlust next turn.
Yeah, he kind of has to clear. And at the moment, he doesn't have a way to full clear. He has double Consecration.
Double Consecration plus Bluegill could full clear.
Oh, that is full clear.
He has the way to take everything out.
And that would actually mean that he wouldn't have to use his second equality as well, which means he has a Wild Pyromancer and an equality left in his deck for an emergency clear later on. But is that worth all the resources? The Bluegill Warriors aren't necessarily resources because with anything can happen, those are going to come back later on in the game.
Yeah, well, if he doesn't play his Consecrations here, he's just going to die to Bloodlust. So Hamster recognizes that threat, clears off the board. He is still at a rather precarious life total, just 14. And Jason, having gotten so many additional resources from Azure Drakes and Mana Tide Totems, he's just able to reload.
And he was actually pretty close to lethal damage just there with the 4 damage from the spell-powered lightning bolts. And even if he had drawn spell power, he'd been a little bit off. With a Wrath of Air Totem, he'd been at 13 total. But 1 off lethal is getting very close, and Jasonzhou smells blood in this matchup.
Yeah, and Hamster here, he still has just a lot of powerful cards in his hand, but none of them that necessarily deal with the board right now. We see a second copy of Anything Can Happen, and this is one of the dangers of playing this really high-end, high-power deck, particularly with cards that are situationally powerful, like Anything Can Happen. There is that second War Leader in his hand, and if he had that dead, if he had another Bluegill dead, those would be great. But right now, Anything Can Happen, not much is happening. It's only 2 Murlocs.
And that Ivory Knight didn't really do much help either. Steel Champion still dead in the hand for Hamster. So he looks like he's going to opt for the Cairn. I imagine he's just going to try to put as much stuff on the board as possible this turn to maybe try and get an Anything out next turn. But even if he puts down the War Leader and it dies this turn, he would only summon, I believe, 2 Warlocks. Oh no, 3 Warlocks because he played a War Leader earlier. So 1 War Leader, or 2 War Leaders and 1 Bluegill Warrior.
So what Hamster's doing here, he's trying to preserve his life as much as he can. I think this may actually just be lethal damage from Jason, though.
It is.
Flame Tongue. He's got so much damage. Bloodlust represents 12. This is well over lethal for Jasonzhou here. Hamster tries to put up a fight, but the Murlocs are not enough, and Jasonzhou is able to even the series at 1 game apiece.
Yeah, and this is just one of those matchups where it's very tough to win if you're the Paladin. Hamster even had a good start. He was able to keep the board clear. He was able to keep